Hi all, this is a quick video going over the hardware area here at MakeHaven. So these are the hardware shelves, and we're going to look at how each of the types of hardware is sorted. So first of all, just to cover the types of hardware, we have screws, and screws have pointy tips and threads, and those are for going into wood or metal. They don't go into nuts, they just screw directly into something else because they have those pointy tips that let them thread in. Then we have bolts. So these are bolts. Bolts have not pointy tips, flat tips, and they have threads, and they thread into nuts. The nuts are down here, and washers also can go on the bolts when they get threaded through things. Then we also have nails up here, and nails don't have threads, but they do have pointy tips, and they just hammer straight into normally wood. Then there are a bunch of sort of more specialty things. These are construction fasteners. And then these are different kinds of screws. These are drywall and deck screws. So we're going to start with bolts. Within the world of bolts, there are metric and imperial bolts. So these are the metric and these are the imperial. The imperial we use mostly in the United States. Metric is what the rest of the world uses. So for both metric and imperial bolts, they are first categorized by their diameter. So here for a metric M8 bolt, the threads have a diameter of 8 millimeters. And then down here for say a quarter 20 bolt, it has a 1/4 inch diameter around the threads. Then the next number, both in the metric and the imperial, is the threads. So the thread pitch is what it's called, is in the metric system, how many millimeters each thread is. So this is 1.25 millimeters per thread. If you were to measure the width of a thread, it'd be 1.25 millimeters. And then in the imperial bolts, say again for 1/4 20, it's 20 threads per inch. So if you were to hold up a ruler, there'd be 20 threads per inch on these bolts. Then the next number is the length. So here we have 1/4 20 by a 1/2 inch long, and similarly on the metric. So here's M8 1.25 by 3.5 centimeters, or sometimes it's in millimeters, so 25 millimeters, but it's just the difference of where the decimal point is. And they're organized by diameter. So we start with the smallest diameters, and they go up and up and up and up until we get to large metric bolts. And within each diameter, the lengths go up. So here for M6 starts here with the small ones that are 10 to 20, and then the type of head. So this has a hex head, which looks like these, and then there are pan heads that look like that. And if you're interested in learning more about those, there are these sheets here that cover all the different kinds of head types and fastener types. Now, if you have hardware and you're trying to sort it into here, either into the metric bolts or the imperial, which goes from small 1, 2, and then large 1, 2, and 3, the way to do it is first to measure the thread, because that's how you know which area you're in. You can use any of these thread checkers. So you just take a bolt and try to thread it into here, or this one for the imperial. Similarly here, there's a even larger array of sizes. And once you've figured out the diameter, you can use the ruler down here to figure out the length. So then you'll have all the information you need to figure out which bin it goes into. For the larger diameters of bolts, like when you're looking at a 1/4 inch or up to 5/16 and higher, then you just have a normal inch fraction for the diameter of the bolts. But below a 1/4 inch, it does a funny thing where it turns into a number. So here we have 10, 24, and 10 obviously isn't the size of the bolt directly. So for those, for 10, 8, say all the way down, here we have 1/64, which are teensy little bolts. For those, you just need to look at a reference to know what size they are. So you can either, use this sheet and it'll tell you for, say, a nut that small or a bolt that small, what size it is. Then there are also some other resources, like on these cards, there's a ton of useful information. So let's look at 1032. So if we took a size 10 bolt, it would fit nicely into this size 10 hole. And it says right above it that the thread sizes available for 10 are 1024 and 1032. 1024 is called coarse because it's a coarser thread, and then 32 is fine because it's the finer thread. And underneath the 10 it says 0.19. So if you were to use calipers and measure that bolt and it read 0.19, then you would know that that converts to a size 10 bolt. And if we flip it over, then for that size 10 hole, it has a bunch of other numbers above it. And so here it'll say for if you're putting in a screw into softwood and it's a size 10 screw, then you put a 3/32 hole into it. For hardwood, then you do a slightly bigger hole, 7/64. And then underneath are the drill sizes that you would use to drill into a piece of metal that you wanted to tap with threads for that bolt to go into. When you're measuring the length of screws and bolts, it's important to take note of two general different categories of head types. So there are some head types that have flat bottoms, so anything that's, say, so anything like this that's pan head, the bottom of a pan head or of a hex head or button cap screw is flat. And so when you're measuring the length of this kind of bolt or screw, you measure from the bottom of the head to the tip. So you would measure it like this. But if you're using a countersunk bolt, something like this, then the bottom of the head has that countersunk shape to it. And that means that it's going to sit down in your material, either wood or metal, but that top is going to sit flush. And so when you're measuring a bolt or a screw like this, you measure from the top of the head, like that. And so that, can be important, especially with bigger bolts. That'll affect your length significantly. So that's just an important distinction between all of the flat bottom head types and then the countersunk bottom head types. If there isn't already a bin for that type of fastener, then you can either add a bin and reorganize these so that it fits, or you can just throw it out. And if it's a whole box of fasteners that you're adding, then it might make sense to add a little bin for them. But if it's just one, then it probably makes sense just to throw it in the metal scrap. There are other ways that the fasteners can be sorted. So they could be sorted more specifically by the head type, because there's lots of different head types, and also by the material. But since we're not trying to have a whole hardware store here, we just kind of, put them together, and then you can pick through and find what's useful to you. We found sort of a middle ground of organizing here. So that is pretty much the bolts. Then we're going to look at nuts, which go onto the bolts, and those are pretty similar. We don't need the length because all the nuts, don't really have much length to them, so it's just the thread size, and the metric nuts are down at the bottom. Those ones down there. And there are different types of nuts, so you can go through these, or you can look on the sheet up above to see the different types of nuts. And then these are the washers. In terms of screws, so there are wood screws, and the wood screws have threads that don't go up all the way. So you drill a hole in your top piece of wood for the screw to go through, and then in the bottom piece that pulls them together. So that's why it's smooth here, so it isn't pulling, the threads aren't engaging the top piece of wood. In sheet metal screws, they have threads that go the full length, and there are also these self-drilling screws, and those have little drills on the tips so they can drill through sheet metal. We also have the drywall and deck screws, and these are generally a little longer and can be used for decking and drywall. These are all different types of construction fasteners that you use for different construction purposes. This bin is Tapcon, so this is for going into masonry and concrete. For the screws, they are also done first by the size of the diameter, which is a number, and then the second number is the length. To figure out the number of a screw, you use one of these sheets, and you see which is the smallest hole that screw will fit through, and that's the number. So you just keep putting it through the holes until you get to the smallest number, and then you'll see that it's, say, a number 8 screw, and then you measure the length, and then you know which screw it is. And then up here we have nails. And so nails can be sorted a bunch of different ways, but since we didn't want to have 10 million bins of nails, here they're just sorted by length. So there might be different gauges or thicknesses or head types for the same length, but you can sort of pick through those. So, for 1 1/4, here these look like roofing nails with those big heads, and here's 1 1/4 brad nails, which are very small heads that'll sit flush in your material. There are also tacks and staples and other things in here. This isn't super well sorted yet, but hopefully will be at some point. Then we sort of have an assortment of miscellaneous boxes, and over here this isn't terribly well sorted yet. These are extra quarter 20 fasteners. Down there is sort of an assortment. Down there are big bins of screws, and then here are some more assorted fasteners. And over here is a bunch of cabinetry hardware.